thinking that I would read about it, but then I didn't even see the
Are you ready? He's ready.
Doesn't fit your holes at all.
Getting the thumbs up.
I'm getting a thumbs up.
Okay.
Well, I don't know. We have 2 minutes on the clock.
I think the clock's wrong.
I think it's
John, what's the
Yeah.
story?
All right, then.
It's fixed.
because mine says
It
4.
wasn't that early.
All right.
Even with a new battery, it's slow.
Verizon says it's 4 o'clock.
Yeah, and so does mine. So let's call a meeting to order, and I want to just mention, since I have microphone and I can say this, that I see that we're not the only ones planning, because there was a couple going in, and by the looks of the veil and the flowers, there was somebody getting married upstairs right now, so, all right.
Wow.
We're not the only ones planning. I hope we all feel better about that. So,
They didn't invite us?
let's look then at the consent agenda, and do I hear a motion for approval or correction of the summary minutes of September 19th, 2017 meeting?
So moved.
Second?
Been moved and seconded. Any discussion, any changes? If not, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, same sign, and motion carries. So we'll go to the only item on the agenda for today, public hearing items. It's application Z17-5, filed by the Salina Planning Commission, requesting a comprehensive view and amendment of Article 7, Division 2, Sections 42409 to 42417 of the Salina zoning ordinance affecting rezoning to a planned commercial district. This has been continued from the August 15th meeting.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have had a follow-up study session, and just to back things up a little bit, we just want to reiterate that the use of planned commercial districts, the planned commercial district regulations, is not something new. As a matter of fact, it's been part of our ordinance for 30 years. And this text amendment is a result primarily of feedback received from the City Commission and from you as planning commissioners in terms of being frustrated with the process that was used in the case of a application on South Ohio Street. The feedback we got was that commissioners found the current ordinance confusing and didn't like the process that was followed. So we have gone back with the assistance of the city attorney, and we came up with a draft set of revisions. The revision that we came up with essentially required that all cases that involved rezoning would result in a planned commercial district application. Essentially, that would mean that there would be no such thing as an application for straight C1 or C2 or C3 zoning. And so reaction when that was shared with design professionals and those in the development community was that that was a over breadth of application, and that maybe it could be a little more narrowly tailored, that instead of just having it purely discretionary, to at least have some predictability. So what we thought we would start with here is just to refresh the commission that your predecessors have spent a number of public meetings and hearings reviewing cases related to rezoning or cases related to the review of site plans in planned commercial districts. And one of the points of emphasis has been to focus on the gateways, entryways, and the prominent intersections in the community. And a lot of you may not recall, I believe Mr. Story does, that at Schilling and I-135, that was not a full interchange. And so right about the time that Walmart was proposing to relocate from, they were located in Midstate Plaza, and they decided to locate new on Schilling Road and 9th Street, and there was not a full interchange there, but in the midst of that review, KDOT announced plans to put in a full diamond intersection there. And because of that, and because that was a new entryway into the community, that became a area of focus as far as having an planned and orderly commercial corridor there. There's lots of traffic. The streets are wide, and they have been widened in phases, but the focus, you can see that virtually everything in the vicinity of that intersection was done as a planned commercial district. The other thing that was done when interest was expressed in developing farther down 9th Street and utilities were extended, there was a South 9th Street overlay district, and that overlay district required that everything be done in that overlay as a planned commercial. So the location of the Hilton Garden Inn, there is actually a mini storage facility that's a little island of city on the east side of 9th Street. And then we have Long MacArthur Ford and Marshall Motors were done as planned commercial districts. Then out here at Waterwell and I-135, again, there was interest in making sure that there was planned and orderly commercial development. So the planned commercial was done at that location, and it is the same here. And part of the reason here was there has always been a struggle where past plans had this as residential and had this as all industrial. And so the plan that we came up with, working with the owners of what's referred to as the Liberty Edition here, was that this was all done as a planned commercial district there, and that was so that we could have a transition area between the residential north of Schilling and industrial down here by having a commercial transition area. So if you look at the map of the community, a lot of the focus of the use of planned commercial districts has been at either important intersections or at gateways into the community. Some of the locations, if you want to scroll farther north, John, you can see that there's not much on Crawford Street because that has been a historically zoned commercial area for a long period of time, and there's established commercial zoning. So most of the planned commercial districts that we have on our map were done as a result of some rezonings. And
Dean, before you go any further, on the southwest corner of Schilling in Ohio, you say it's zone commercial,
correct.
but there appears to be a sign that indicates that those are going to be homes. Is that not, am I misinterpreting the sign?
I believe you are. That's owned by the South Ohio Land Company. I don't think they're under any, they are marketing that as commercial property. Their two existing tenants are the Sunflower Bank headquarters and Kennedy and Co. And I think those are examples of quality development that have that serve as a, if that was replicated along that side, but that is what is envisioned for the rest of the south side of Schilling Road, is a continuation of what you see there with Kennedy and Co. and Sunflower Bank. And then farther south is in industrial. But the residential portion here in Quail Meadows is just about built out, and all we have left are the commercial lots. And so this was done as a planned commercial, again, to help the planning for commercial to fit in with the residential around it. And it is it's easier to plan it out in advance, and there has been a desire to keep the Ohio corridor different than the 9th Street corridor, or different than the Broadway corridor in terms of uses. And so that's why planned commercial district was used there, that there's a number in those developments, there's a number of uses that might be allowed as permitted uses that have been deleted from those planned districts. So C5 district allows used car lots, but even though these properties are zoned Plan C5, none of them allow used car lots, because in conjunction with the applicant and the Planning Commission, those uses were deleted. So that is the primary use of planned commercial districts has been in areas where there was either sensitivity to the design or sensitivity to the uses. And so obviously there's only been a couple of these that have gone before the Planning Commission, but virtually every development in this area has involved a site plan that went to the Planning Commission for review.
So I wanted to get a little clearer about that too, because I noted the sign that appeared to call for residential lots, and I was thinking we had talked about that before in that area, and I'm not positive that it's within the planned commercial district boundaries that we show here on the map. But isn't there an attempt to build residential?
There was discussions that we had at the end of 2015 carrying into 2016 about a particular developer who was interested in trying to amend the comprehensive plan to change that from an employment center to something else, or to amend the employment land use category to allow for residential use. And so we had discussions about that, but they withdrew their interest in that property, and nothing was changed. But I don't believe that the owners there are attempting to market it as residential property, because the lots that are there are way too large for individual residential development. So we will look at that, but I go by that corner frequently, and I don't recall anything. There's a sign there for Liberty Edition and for South Ohio Land, but I don't believe it's advertising it as residential.
Okay. All right.
You recall that a subdivision was approved over here at the southeast corner, and that is residential, but no activity has occurred at that time. John, we had a ordinance, it says maybe you don't have that slide anymore. It was the planned commercial ordinance that was done for the Menards project. Is that included as a slide or just the site plan? Okay. So, yeah, the ordinance itself is in the packet, but I guess if you could go to the Menard site plan, John. And so as a refresher, and is that the only site plan, John, or is the other one in there, the more stepped out view? I guess we'll look at this, but in the case of Menards, as we recreate this was a 40-acre parcel at the southwest corner of the interchange of Magnolia and I-135, and the only identified use at the time of application was Menards. And so what occurred there was a planned commercial district was created, and the plan was to defer approval of the site plans on the remaining outlots until uses were identified. And so that was not specifically codified in the planned commercial district regulations that were enacted in 1987, but it had been the long-time practice. So one of the things that is in the text amendment that we want everyone to understand is that there could be cases that come forward where it might be appropriate to do a planned commercial district, but the uses are not identified, And so what everyone would have to understand is that you would have the authority to approve the zoning, but then defer approval of the site plan until uses were identified. So in this case, Menards was done in 2008 and 2009, and then in 2015, there was a plan that came forward for a Fairfield Inn to be constructed in this location that's under construction now. And because the planned commercial district created there deferred the site plan and had the Planning Commission as the reviewing body, then that site plan had to be reviewed and approved by you before a building permit was issued. So the draft that we have retains that as an option for the development community to say it can be done as a planned district, but if we don't have our uses identified, then the actual approval of the site plan. Because if we took an approach here in Salina with our pace of development, it is not practical or realistic to expect a developer to come in and have details of this lot and this lot up here and everything if they have a primary anchor. So Lowe's was the primary anchor for that development, and then the other uses filled in, and those plans were reviewed individually by the Planning Commission. So that particular model is maintained in this draft ordinance. So what we'd like to discuss with you today, John, if you could go with the text. What we have done is we have put the draft prepared by the city attorney in your packets, but then we've, at the end of it, we've added this, and based on our discussions at our study session, the idea with the substitute is that we'll wait till, so what you see there at the top is in the draft, initial public hearing draft prepared by the city attorney. And what that would require is that any time a property owner applies for zoning from a non-commercial zoning classification to a commercial one, or from one commercial to another, that would have to be done as a planned commercial district. So no matter what, no matter where you fill out an application for commercial zoning, it has to be done as a planned district. And the response back was that might be overly broad in its application, that there could be established corridors or places where there's an incremental expansion of an existing commercial lot where that would seem to be unnecessary. So since the comprehensive plan primarily focuses on commercial centers, neighborhood centers, and gateway corridors in terms of changing the pattern and appearance of development, what we were proposing as an alternative would be that if we're dealing with an applicant and we identify that the property is in a commercial center, a neighborhood center, or a gateway corridor in the comprehensive plan, then that will come to you as a planned commercial district. And in addition, this proposes to retain the ability of the Planning Commission or Board of Commissioners to direct a property owner to amend their application to planned commercial zoning if you find that a planned commercial district is needed to ensure more compatible land use relationships. So if there is an application to rezone a residential property that's next to other residential property, and there's an application to rezone it to commercial, based on the plan and the surroundings, you may think that that's appropriate, but you may be concerned about some uses that you don't think are appropriate there, or a design that you don't think is appropriate there. So if an applicant is outside those areas and they apply for straight commercial zoning, but you or the city commission feel like because of the surrounding neighborhood or residential uses that you want to see that done as planned commercial to make sure that it's compatible with surrounding development, that retains your discretion. So what happened in the case of the original application on South Ohio is that came forward as an application for straight commercial zoning. You as a commission didn't feel comfortable with that and said that you would like to see that application considered in accordance with a plan and a use as a planned commercial district to make it more compatible with surrounding development. So at your direction, the property owner applicant amended their application and it came forward as a planned commercial district. As it turned out, at that particular point in time, we couldn't get anything more than a conceptual plan, certainly not a site plan that the Planning Commission or staff would be used to receiving to do a detailed review of the plan. So that zoning change was approved subject to deferred submittal of a plan. And so this basically narrows the universe of required planned commercial designations from the entire community to just those areas that are commercial centers, neighborhood centers. I think that's supposed to be community centers. I think that's a mistype there. So it should be community center, neighborhood center, and gateway corridor. So does any members of the commission have any thoughts or comments about that change? Because what we're trying to do is have some predictable criteria that if somebody's coming into the community and they're looking for a parcel and they get out the comprehensive plan and they see that it's in a community center, neighborhood center, or gateway area, and we show them that, then they're going to understand that they need to submit their application as a planned commercial district. And if they're outside any of those areas and they're applying, then there would not be a requirement. They still, if they needed deviations or of their own volition, if they wanted to do it as a planned district, they could, but it would not be required.
My feeling about the possible substitute language in Section 2 is it covers everything that we've asked and that we had issues with. And it clarifies the fact that we're very concerned about commercial centers, neighborhood centers, designated zones being appropriately developed, which I think addresses the issue during that time. My question would be in the possible substitute language for Section 14. I like all 7 points very much, but I'm concerned that they may have come too directly from the experience on South Ohio. Are we missing things in that 7 points that don't relate directly to that particular event? Obviously, ingress and egress was a major concern. So, and that's number 4. Arrangement of buildings, we spoke about that. Safe movement of pedestrians, all of those things, again, link really directly to that particular site plan. Number 6, xeriscaping, obviously is more uniform, and I'm very much in support of that being elevated to a status that it's primary in terms of landscape design. But my only concern would be whether or not there should be more items.
Right.
Consent.
And there certainly could be. And if John, if you want to switch gears and go to the, and do we have the things from the comprehensive plan in there? Because I can't tell from
They're on
this
our next
description
page.
here. Right, but the question is whether John has them in the slideshow.
And while he's looking for that, yeah, I mean, not just from Commissioner Freiberger, but from any of us, are there
Did we
other
actually not get that?
things we should be
Yes,
included?
The areas that we talked about here, the future
Because I watched you
center,
put it
neighborhood
in
center,
there.
gateway corridor, how does an overlay district fit into that?
Okay, we will, as soon as we can get John to call this up, we're going to compare these things. So what we had there was, as part of our review, we reviewed about 15 peer communities in Kansas. We reviewed ordinances from other communities. We reviewed our own staff reports. And those 7 criteria are based on what we would do in the normal course of a commercial plan review. And the most important part of today's meeting, the public hearing aspect of that, is what we hear over and over from the development community is a desire for predictability. So if what and we'll get back to that list, but the other side of the coin that was talked about in the case of the original Popeye site plan was how it related to the development criteria in the comprehensive plan.
Exactly.
So what we have is these are the elements. They are both the same in the community center and the neighborhood center in the comprehensive plan. The issue with these is that in some cases they may be applicable and in some cases they may not be applicable. So, for instance, this scale and style of development should be compatible with that of the surrounding neighborhood. I think that would always be something that you as planning commissioners would look at. Having public focal points or spaces, that's going to be the exception, not the rule, because not every site is amenable to having a public plaza or focal point. There may be some that should, but the vast majority of them wouldn't. These 2 items are important elements in the comprehensive plan. They're something that we hear about virtually every planning commission meeting. These are somewhat subjective, but incorporating these puts the development community on notice that these are things that are important as part of plan review. If you have a site plan for an individual use for a Taco Bell restaurant, I doubt that I think forcing them to have multiple tenants when their design is to have a single use is not really defensible. I think having quality design materials, while somewhat can be subjective, that's certainly something that you could evaluate. And if you're dealing with a new development that is in a 1950s commercial area, then you may not have a comprehensive urban design scheme because it is one particular use. And we think that this should always be something that's considered anytime you have a transition between a commercial use and less intense adjacent uses. So we're always looking at buffering, plantings. Again, we've heard feedback from the development community at times about they're not so keen on buffer strips and having some of those things, but it is something that has been important, and it can certainly help a plan gain more acceptance to the surrounding neighborhood if the developer recognizes that there's a transition buffer between their use and an existing neighborhood. So if you could go to the site development design principles slide, John. This is just something we added to help frame the discussion. And while we don't think that those 7 criteria are, and this is not in your packet, but it is on the screen. So what we think could be a way to go about having the site plan review criteria is to break it down between design standards and design principles or guidelines, so that these standards are things that are mandatory. If you apply for approval of a site plan for a use that's not permitted in that district, then your plan can be denied. If you have a plan that does not have a safe and orderly ingress and egress, your plan can be denied. The design principles or guidelines would be something that staff would use and you would use to evaluate how the plan is consistent with the development criteria for the land use category the property is in, and we would go through those as part of any review, but recognizing that the fact that something is not multi-tenant is not a basis for denying the plan. So what we're proposing is that you could have a set of design standards that are minimums that have to be met. Your trash area has to be screened. You have to have front yard landscaping. You have to have enough parking. You have to have buffer yards. You can't have a building that's too tall. You can't have lighting that spills into the neighborhood. Those are standards that your plan has to meet. And if the applicant says, no, I want to build right up to the edge of the residential and I won't put a buffer in, that's a basis for saying no to the plan. But the other things would be things that would be something that is intended to provide guidance or encouragement to design towards, but would not be a basis for saying, no, your plan doesn't meet our standards. So we think that the way to go about this is to take what's in the comprehensive plan and use those as guidelines, and then if you could go back to that change in the original language, John, in section 14. These are to get the discussion going. And so those 7 items there are for you to react to and say, we don't think this is, it's actually the one before that, John. It's I guess it would be called the comparison. Yeah. So it's these 7 points here. Right. So what Dustin and I did was, we have recently issued 3 commercial building permits. One is for the northeast corner of Magnolia and 9th Street where the UMB Bank was. You did not see those plans. They did not come before you. That property zoned straight C5, and that was a building permit. 2 other projects. One is the AT&T retail store south of Longhorn Steakhouse. That's in a planned development district, so you did review the plans for that building. And there was an outlot in front of Walmart, and you did review those plans. And so what Dustin and I did is we went through and say, whether it's a plan district or it's a commercial plan review, what are the things that we're doing when we go through and review a set of commercial plans? These are the ones that we came up with. The list could be longer. We look at parking, we look at circulation, we look at buffers, we look at front yard landscaping, we look at the driveway locations. This one could be expanded or tightened up. Some people would say that is somewhat subjective, but what we're trying to achieve in this list here is that if the Planning Commission doesn't feel that a plan should be approved and you're trying to make a motion to not approve the plan, then it's whatever you come up with in this set of criteria here that would become the basis for your decision. And so right. if 7 needs to be 10 or it needs to be 12 or whatever, that is the purpose of this hearing, and that is the purpose is to get your feedback, because what we don't want to have occur is to adopt these changes to the ordinance, have site plans come before you, and then have planning commissioners bring things out as something you're evaluating the plan on that's not in this criteria.
So Dean, the piece that we didn't have in the packet that you put up as far as site plans, am I understanding right that those standards spelled out generally that you had on the screen might encompass some of those?
Well,
of any other potential additions to this list? Was that the intent of your
Right.
comment?
So, and we're going to just have to keep asking you to flip back and forth, John, from the comparison back to the principles. But what we're suggesting or proposing, whether it's those 7 points or that 7 expands into 12 or whatever you determine, those are, we'll just say,
those would be the standards?
These are bottom line things. These are things that the Planning Commission is willing to base their decision on, whether it is an
Yeah.
approvable or not approvable plan.
So the design standards mentioned there in that first sentence,
That they are
that mandatory
they are
requirements that must be met.
And if
what we're
you-
saying is that these 7 that you have outlined would be examples
those
that we
are
would look at.
examples of something that we would consider to be mandatory based on how
Right.
we as a staff
Right.
review plans.
Okay.
These other things, you can call them goals, you can call them aspirations, you can call them expectations, you can call them guidelines. But, so now, John, if you can flip back to the site development standards. These are what is directly in the comprehensive plan. And so what we're suggesting is that we think that these should be referenced in the ordinance, that these are things that you as a commission and we as a staff are going to look at, but we're suggesting is basically in the part that we're putting people on notice, the criteria for evaluating a plan, that we're going to have what we would call standards that you have to meet, and then we're going to have these that are also going to be used by you to evaluate the plan. But that it wouldn't, that we could not say that these are mandatory, because that would simply say if you come before the Planning Commission and you are trying to get a site plan approved for a hotel, we're not going to approve it because you don't have multiple tenants. That is not it's not really a tenable way to administer the ordinance. On the other hand, having this in there would encourage that as people plan larger commercial areas, that they provide space for multiple tenants, or that they make sure that pedestrian accessibility and circulation is incorporated. And my classic example, because Planning Commission did the review, I did the report. They were 2 corporations that didn't really, let's say, communicate and cooperate with each other, but we had a Sam's Club and we have a Target, and they are right next to each other. And you cannot take a vehicle, or there is no sidewalk that allows you to shop at Target and walk on a sidewalk and walk up to the liquor store or to Sam's Club, because at the time that was done, the corporations didn't want to have interconnections, and at the time, the pedestrian accessibility and those types of things weren't as much on the forefront as they are now in terms of recognition. So that would be an example where if somebody came forward and they had a plan, and there's a Sam's Club here and there's a Target right next to it, and they say, we refuse to provide any pedestrian accessibility to our site, that could form a basis for you to say, well, we're not going to approve your plan unless you provide some pedestrian accessibility.
And that would be in the comprehensive plan development criteria, for example, a comprehensive urban design scheme. That would be one of the criteria.
Well,
Yes.
and this, that pedestrian accessibility between all sites should be incorporated into the development.
Yeah, other
So
questions? Yes, Commissioner.
What you have there is that you don't have a accessibility or circulation for pedestrians between Target
Right.
and Sam's Club.
Right. So, Commissioner Jackson, you good?
Dean, I have a question, and I apologize if this is out of order.
And I might encourage all commissioners, when they're speaking, to speak into the mic, just for the
sorry.
purposes of, yeah, okay.
Well, we have talked before about walkability as was the word, rather than just these descriptors. One of the things that prevents walkability, obviously, is when all the parking is in front and the buildings are a long distance if you were to try to negotiate from one to another. Is it appropriate to say that we would favor putting parking behind? That is a big step, and I realize you can't change the whole community. It's all, much of it is already established and impossible. But if we don't do it eventually, there will never really be a walkability in Salina. The parking in front is the end of getting most people from one place to another, given our climate and so on.
Well, one of the things we discussed, and we've seen it in those, and it's something that you need to evaluate, is that one of the contradictions between our plan and our reality is that Ohio and Crawford, no matter what development pattern you put around it, is not really a pedestrian-friendly environment, particularly in terms of crossing the streets and those types of things. So one of the things to consider, and we discussed it, if you took CVS Pharmacy and you flipped it and you put the building right on the corner and you put the parking in behind and you had sidewalks on Ohio and Crawford, does that act alone make the Crawford, Ohio intersection more pedestrian friendly?
Yeah, correct.
If 1/4 of it, yes.
1/4.
And then there's just 3/4 to do.
Right.
Yeah.
Like
To me, that makes all the difference
It
in the
does make all the
livability of
difference.
the community.
Like assurance partners.
But I'd
Yeah.
like to respond to that, Commissioner Jackson, and take the opposite view, because that's what really caused this whole discussion, and that is the development community feeling that they didn't have exact requirements. So, I want to be sensitive to the development community because they're the ones that brought this to light, and I appreciate that because we've had the discussion, the ability to actually revise more of these standards. But on the other hand, as a developer, I do want to be sensitive to that. And if I was coming into this community, there are still things that aren't clear to me, as a developer, as far as what Salina would want. I'm concerned with number 3 still in the development standards.
Okay.
There's a whole lot in that sentence.
There is.
There is. And first of all, I want to thank staff because you guys have done an amazing job putting this together. But I looked at number 3 and then I looked at number 7. Those, in a sense, to me are the same thing, even though screening sort of follows landscaping, which is used as screening. But I was more concerned about placement of those items, like trash disposal areas and outdoor storage areas, than I was screening, actually. Because if they're appropriately placed, screening isn't as big of an issue. And I think that we heard from the public that their concern was more the placement of them. And that became an issue during the dialogue, whether or not that was necessary. The development community, they didn't seem to feel that that was necessary to take into consideration, that pure screening was enough. But we're looking at areas that probably will be bordering residential areas. So I think that's important. But number 3, loading, for example, would be a key word there. I think loading denotes that it may need screening as an area, that it needs to be appropriately placed, much like trash. I don't know. I mean, my point is that 3 seems like a whole lot of components that aren't necessarily specified in terms of what we're expecting. And then in the actual development criteria in section 14, number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, what is it? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7. Development should have a comprehensive urban design scheme. Great statement, but I don't understand it. I have no idea what that means. And, I'm a developer, and I've just come to Salina. I have my own complete idea of what that means. And it's based on wherever I've come from and my understanding of urban design. But that seemed to be a key factor in our comments that we heard from the development community, that it would be hard to define that kind
Yeah,
of thing.
I agree.
But
That's a
And
tough
part
one.
so
of it. Can I just ask, Mr. Andrew, isn't that part of what you were saying, is that these criteria for the comprehensive plan connection of necessity are not as direct as directive
Right.
as the others?
Well,
Right, their
And
language there
we use
to
the
interpret.
term when we talk about codes, and one of the things that we struggle with is that even today, the zoning ordinance is prescriptive. It prescribes
Yeah.
your building has to be set back this far. You can only cover this much of your lot. You must provide this number of spaces. It prescribes things. The comprehensive plan is not prescriptive. If we get a building permit in to put a new building where the UMB Bank building was, we can't deny a building permit because your plan doesn't meet our comprehensive plan. We can deny it if the plan doesn't meet our zoning code, but we can't deny it if it doesn't meet the comprehensive plan. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to incorporate the principles, and I would agree with you, but it's also why our comprehensive plan is not perfect by any, not every word and phrase and principle in the comprehensive plan is perfect.
And I'm not saying it needs to be changed necessarily. I feel like we need to acknowledge that it is very broad.
Right.
And their concerns seem to be that the next transition of board members may call for a different concept of urban design
Right.
than what we feel. And the follow after that will have a different concept of urban design. And to me, that's what's good. But to
Yes,
a developer,
yes,
that's what they
Yeah.
fear. However, I can't imagine the same people will be bringing things 10 years from now. But I like the open-endedness of it. But what we heard from them is that it was too broad.
Commissioner Freiberger, I agree with you. I think that's exactly correct. And when we were having that discussion in study session, I'm translating, I think, what you're saying, but that's the democratic process. Yes, you're going to have different people up here, for better or worse. You hope that you get good people in these seats to translate it, but that's what you need.
And my response at that time was that was a good thing, and the community
Right.
involvement engagement was why we're here as a board, and otherwise there'd be no reason for us to participate
Right.
if we were to say these are the design standards today that will last for the next 25 years. Just follow the list, submit it through the office, and have fun.
Yeah, and could I come back? You're putting out the trash disposal area screening, that specific prescription. Do you have language to suggest location? I'm just thinking a screen where necessary, or move from a main.
I think it could actually be
path.
incorporated into number 3.
Well,
without being a
one of
separate
the options
entity.
for number in the operative word in number 3 there is arrangement.
Right.
And so certainly the trash disposal areas could be added to that list. We could say the proposed location and arrangement. We can add that in there.
Yeah, I just think it needed to have something about appropriate placement. And I
Okay.
don't like to use the word appropriate because it begins again to suggest that I
Right.
think what's appropriate is
Well,
different than
if-
what somebody
if
else
I-
is.
Let's just, if we mentally arrange, and John doesn't have it up on the screen, but I've got number 3 here in front of me. If we could go back to that, John. Not to that, but to the comparison. It's one of the 3 slides. So stay there, John. The proposed location and arrangement, and we could insert the word trash disposal areas, is compatible with adjacent land uses. And let's say that we had that enacted, this and it was in place. And you had a site plan, and of all the places they chose to put their trash disposal area, it was right closest to the residential area. And if this was in place and we added the word location or placement, and we made sure that that covered trash disposal areas, and that you could make a finding that the proposed location of the trash disposal area was not compatible with the adjacent land uses. And that would be a basis to either modify the plan or not approve it as submitted. So that is one approach. The other approach is to take, we could have gone deeper and said, we're going to have one criteria for buildings and one criteria for parking and one criteria for loading areas. But because Dustin and I reviewed the plans for the new Dillon store at Clouden, Ohio. And one of the things we did in working with them is that we tried to get the building. And we can discuss whether the parking should have been in front or not in front, but it was. We looked at the loading areas. We looked at lighting. We looked at their signage. We looked at their landscaping and screening, and obviously their drainage. But one of the things that we tried to make sure we did is that their rear loading area does back up to Sterling House and some residential uses there. So there is a buffer and there is fencing back behind their loading area there, and we look carefully at what the lighting would be back there. You don't want wall-packed lighting on the back of a loading area that's going to go straight out into the backyards of residences. So those are the types of things that we look at, but there's other things we could, there's also the question of drive-through or drive-up windows. And there's the trash disposal areas, and those things could incorporate in here. But the other approach is to say, well, gee, that's too many things loaded up into one thing. But what we're trying to do is say, it's not the use, it's not the activities on the site, it's how they're located and arranged. And if they were located and arranged differently, then the plan might be more approvable.
I'd like to, at least in looking through these, my first thought about that is it seems to me developers are going to look at specifics. And if you have it on a separate item, they're more likely to pay attention. And the trash storage areas are pretty important. And I agree with Commissioner Freiberger that maybe language that it should be unobtrusive, not just screened, but maybe there could be language about so it's not close to residences or I don't have exact language for that, and I can think about it. But
I think compatible.
I just think the placement should be determined by the people reviewing the plan, whether at that moment it's going to be site specific, depending on if there's a house there. Yeah, so I just think it needs to say arrangement. All outdoor trash disposal areas are screened in arrangements addressed in that sentence also.
May I go back to my question?
I'm sorry.
No,
I got way off track.
I just, I think your objection to making a comment about the parking is that will be something that is an unpredictable issue added to the list for the builders. Is that right?
It is, yes.
How could we ever make a change then?
Well, that's my question, and that's what I think we've been doing for 3 years. But it's been slowly and incrementally. And I don't think we have solidified it in a way that it will come to fruition. I totally agree.
Dean, do you have any thought on that? Is there...
Well, we're right back in this. This is blending in. We'll discuss that. Mr. Boffa brought it up, and we've got to discuss it further. But one of the things that we discussed when we were talking about the whole concept of the neighborhood center overlay, and instead of addressing it through planned commercial, was to have the neighborhood center overlay. The question became that if you have businesses whose plans or model doesn't fit that, or if you create it so that you must have what I'll call a pedestrian-oriented building design mandated as part of an overlay, then you could create the situation where the development community will simply avoid the areas where they have to do that. So there are communities, and I have an example that I've been reviewing, that have maybe a particular street or a particular corridor that they wish to make more pedestrian oriented. Not because you can't remake an entire city, but you can focus on an area or a corridor. So one of the things that we've been assigned to do by the City Commission is to create a West Crawford Corridor Gateway District, an overlay. And an overlay is something, essentially you drop that on top of the existing set of rules. And so what you would do is if we had taken a neighborhood center and we started down that path and then decided it might be too onerous on development, is that you create a neighborhood center overlay district, and within that you require, you mandate. It's a standard that your building must be in front and your parking in back. But if you made that a broad brush requirement everywhere in the community, you're going to get a lot of resistance to that. If it's narrowly tailored to a specific area that we're trying to transform, then it's more defensible. So one of the questions that will be put before the Planning Commission when that West Crawford Gateway overlay comes forward is that something you want to recommend? So if Western Sizzling Steakhouse gets torn down and it's redeveloped, do you want to have a requirement in place that whatever goes back there has to be put in with the building in front and the parking in back, with the expectation that over time West Crawford is become that type of corridor? But you have to pick your locations and you have to pick your battles.
Yeah.
Well, we've discussed that in the past, and that was an area that we'd already targeted for that, because it's the only area that's likely to be mixed use in a sense of future development, where we've got multiple family, residential, commercial, plus it's a gateway area for the city. So that seems like a given to me. And there's not a lot of development there that has been recently done. So, yeah, I think that. But my question would be: does that still involve zoning change and downzoning? And
what it would involve is basically, if you look at our North Ohio overlay, and if you look at most overlays, what it is, it says you get to do activity-wise what your base underlying zoning is. So if it's C5, you get to have those uses. What the overlay district does is it puts standards basically on top of that says we're going to have some standards that regulate the exterior building materials and the placement of the structure and the design of the parking and those types of things.
So, Dean, I'm looking at terminology. Then if we do that, doesn't that in effect then become a planned commercial district? Doesn't an overlay district become a planned commercial?
Because an overlay generally means, and I'm not saying that a overlay district is going to be popular or well received with the entire development community, because it's going right back. But the thing about an overlay district is it's got a geographic boundary, and it's not a blanket that covers the entire city. But if you look at a historic district, that is an example of a type of overlay district. So if you're on South Santa Fe or on Highland and you are in a single-family residential zoning district, but there's also a historic district overlay, and so if you're going to build a new house or if you're going to make modifications to your porch or those types of things, it's going to be reviewed by the Heritage Commission to make sure it's in keeping with the historic character of the district. And we more or less have a overlay district for the downtown area because we have a design review board and they're reviewing facade changes and signs and those types of things. So those are examples of overlay districts. We have a downtown zoning district, and it tells you what uses and setbacks and all that, but the design guidelines that we have for downtown are like an overlay over the downtown. So essentially what we're going to be, because West Crawford, based on the City Commission's direction, is going to be the test case, the first example, then you will have input on building placement, building materials, all those types of things. And the difference is that on the one hand, we're trying to make this so that this planned commercial applies all the way across the city in these circumstances. It's a tool that's available anywhere, whereas the overlay district is focused on the particular characteristics of a corridor.
Okay, so that raises my, I think this is key, and this issue has kind of been burning with me. When we look at the site plan standards 1 through 7 as enumerated, we've been talking about at length here. Okay, so, and I'm like Commissioner Freiberger, I like what I see here. I like the comprehensive nature of it. It's what we've been discussing. And it's an issue what we might add to it. But my question goes to the substitute language or section 2. And I think specifically this is the issue. Will it apply? If we change language, will it be within a commercial center, neighborhood center, or gateway?
And again,
or gateway corridor identified in comprehensive plan. So my question comes from the study session. When we looked at the map, there were not a lot of these colored highlighted districts, the commercial
John,
district.
it's time to go to the neighborhood centers map.
So my question then is, if, and I'm trying to get my mind around this, if you had somebody who wanted to rezone some other area other than those designated as these categories, and if we say here, and I think, by the way, it's commensurate with what Commissioner Freiberger's concerns were at the end of that study session, then aren't we sort of saying carte blanche, we give up the ability to look at those and establish a planned commercial and look at site plans for something other than those located here? That concerns me a little bit.
Well, I mean, it goes back to the question. I believe that and Dustin, there were a number of renditions and revisions and all, and Dustin did the review, but the proposed commercial redevelopment out at 9th and Magnolia, I think, is going to be perceived as a quality redevelopment. Dustin and I were involved in, there was a fairly nondescript, not attractive building that was at the corner of 9th and Magnolia on the south side, and that was redone, which is now the Verizon store, and that corner is much more attractive than it was in its previous condition.
So that was a regular commercial, not planned commercial.
That is a regular commercial.
Yeah.
So the approach that we're taking is that you're going to get a level of improvement with the quality of development with your straight commercial zoning. The purpose of the planned commercial zoning is either to help ameliorate any negative impacts that commercial could have on its neighboring properties, or that you want to have something that's over and above even what our base zoning requirements are, that you want to transform the corridor, or you want to transform the neighborhood. So if your goal is to transform West Crawford into a pedestrian-oriented commercial corridor, and your means of doing that is to require buildings to be pushed to the front and parking to be located in the back, it's because you want to try to transform that corridor. It's not going to happen overnight. They're not going to tear down every building on West Crawford and rebuild, but it would require that whatever went back be done in accordance with that pattern. But you'd have to
Did you say
pick.
earlier that the width of the street is incompatible with pedestrian traffic in the first place?
Well-
Because if that's the case, that may be then something that will fail because of the, I don't know.
One of the challenges, and particularly of Crawford Street and some of our arterials in town, Ohio is the exception because Ohio has pretty much uniformly 100 feet of right-of-way. And Broadway, in portions of it, particularly the southern portion, has 120 feet of right-of-way. Well, you can put paths, you can put widened sidewalks, you can do that and have what's referred to as a buffer space or other things between the sidewalk or the walking path and the traveled way, which makes people feel safer. On Crawford, the right-of-way there is so narrow that it requires that the sidewalk, if there is one, and there is on Crawford, it's right behind the curb. And so when we look at those types of things, no matter what you do on the private side of things, unless you can change the right-of-way profile or do something different there, it's hard. I mean, I live out next to South Ohio, and I will never walk on South Ohio because the sidewalk's right next to the curb, and no one feels safe walking on those sidewalks when you have 40 or 45 mile an hour traffic that feels like it's 6 inches away from you, because it is. And so you have to look at those. To me, if you were spent a lot of effort trying to make private development and buildings be close to Crawford so it would become more pedestrian oriented, but you didn't have a safe walking environment, that is counterproductive.
Yeah.
So what I'm suggesting is that if we create something like a pedestrian overlay or pedestrian oriented overlay where we're trying to get redevelopment to be building front, parking back, you want to do it somewhere where there is already the ability to have a safe or a feel safe walking environment.
I would withdraw my insistence about that place at least if, if that proves to be really the fact.
And that comes to us, and our job as a staff through our reports and everything to try to report what's possible and what's not possible, and that's why we have tried. And I think the one that we had on Broadway was pretty good, where we can have a study session or something where we can focus on a particular corridor, and we can give you all the facts and figures and right-of-way widths and what the capabilities are, because some corridors can be transformed easier than others.
That may be the reason why the comprehensive plan put the emphasis on Broadway as it did. I presume that would have been in their thinking, the width
Yeah,
of
and
the...
the one thing that is not on here is the community center that's at Broadway and Crawford. These are just the neighborhood centers. But the way that we're proposing it, if somebody wanted to rezone property in one of these areas, it would be required that they do it as planned commercial.
My concern would still be that, and I'm sure you're addressing this because you address everything, but this would go back to Commissioner Jackson's constant comments about zoning inconsistencies. So a corridor along West Crawford, obviously that's a dynamic idea. It creates an unfolding, predictive kind of experience as you're going to downtown, and I'm sure that is now the major access point to downtown in Salina. I mean, it is the access point I take, so I assume that is. But will we be looking at those zoning inconsistencies along that corridor again that have caused us not to be able to follow the comprehensive plan?
When you refer to Are you referring to Broadway, or are you referring to
West Crawford?
West Crawford.
Mhm.
So
if we're looking at an overlay there, are you
Right.
also then considering, is the city commission also considering the zoning
what
West Crawford?
what do you consider to be inconsistencies?
I don't know. I haven't reviewed them recently. But
Okay.
when we looked at them initially, there were commercial patterns in places that were supposed to be residential. There,
Well, that was one of the things that the Planning Commission cleaned up at the time of the Quick Shop application, because the Quick Shop site was shown as future residential, and you modified that to basically show Crawford as a commercial corridor from Centennial Road down to Broadway on the south side, and not so much on the north side where you have existing residential development on Vmont and those
and so the
streets there.
comprehensive plan, if they're put side by side with an overlay now, would be compatible. That's my question.
On Crawford, yes. On Broadway, no.
Perfect. Right. Well, that's Broadway's another
Right.
project. But if that's the case, then we've, certainly made one step closer.
Well, I mean, the question about overlay districts was raised. We've been tasked with creating an overlay district for West Crawford from Broadway to I-135. When it's ready, it will go before the Planning Commission, but you will certainly at that point say, how come this doesn't require buildings to be pushed in front and parking in the back? And you're perfectly within your discretion to say, we think in this corridor, this is what should happen. Because and the basis for doing that is the comprehensive plan says that based on the importance of community gateways, development at these locations should be held to a higher site design standard, including landscaping, building orientation, and streetscape amenities. Overlay districts should be considered that can coordinate all elements of development. And so we think that's best accomplished through a overlay district. And so the first one out of the gate is going to be West Crawford. And so that will be a point.
Commissioner Boffa?
Couldn't like, say, 9th Street from Cloud,
And Commissioner Boffa, would you pull the mic down for that? Yeah. Sorry.
the area from Cloud south to the city limits? Shouldn't that, or couldn't that be an overlay district itself too? Because it's basically all commercial.
It could be an overlay district. What would the overlay district consist of above and beyond the requirements that already exist? What elements of that? So the idea behind, and that, I mean, that's a pretty, it's quite a bit to say that whole thing is a gateway, but the idea behind gateway overlays is to have that is the front door to the community. That is a place where you want to impress visitors to your community about the appearance and have an attractive, inviting environment. That's the rationale behind having a gateway overlay district, is to make a positive impression on the gateways into the community for travelers, visitors, that the community seems inviting and they want to come in and spend more time in the community. But we have an overlay district on South 9th. It just starts south of Schilling and goes down to Waterwell. And the purpose of that, so just the one example that I would give is that, and we don't know, it'll come someday. There was a case that was filed in 2007, and then nothing occurred since, but you've got, this is South 9th Street, and you have Belmont here, and then just south of Belmont you have the skating rink, and south of there and north of Sam's Club is what we call the Pumpkin Patch. It's Mr. Dooley's property. It's zoned agricultural. And so under this draft proposal, where our criteria is if you are in a neighborhood center area, community center, or a gateway into the community, then there would not be a requirement that if that were requested for commercial zoning, that be done as a planned commercial district. This draft ordinance would not require that. What this draft ordinance does say is that it reserves the right of the planning commission or city commission to say, we're not comfortable with straight commercial zoning. We think it should be done as planned commercial because that would result in more compatible land use relationships, but you'd have to have some basis of concern about what the requested zoning could have in a way of impact on the residential there on Highland. And Mr. Story was involved, so I will give that as an example. But the very first development that was in there at the corner of Schilling and 9th Street was a Sam's Club store, and there were people on Highland and on Gale there that were concerned about the impact that Sam's Club might have. So as part of the design, there was a detention area, and then there was also a berm that the Planning Commission required. And so if you're out by Sam's Club and you're looking to the north, they have a green space there, and then they also have a raised berm that they planted trees on to provide both a physical buffer and a visual buffer between Sam's Club and the residences to the north. That was not required by our zoning code, but it was required as part of the site plan approval process. So that is something that when you're using a planned commercial district, you have a little more latitude to help the arrangement and location of things to make sure they're compatible with adjacent land uses. So
I want to make sure that I'm following, and I think I follow your example, but I want to be sure. If we're talking about that property, which is presently zone A1 agricultural,
Yes.
Under the new language, even the substitute language, and in the original when required language, and the text amendment comparisons, in either case, that would be rezoning from a non-commercial zoning to a commercial zoning classification,
That is
and
correct.
would require a planned commercial development.
under
right?
under the original draft, or what's labeled as draft language, so I guess we could go back to that, John. And that would be the comparison
Yeah.
slide. And at the very top. So
The
if-
first was the language.
the first is the language that's in the public hearing draft that the city attorney prepared.
Yes, thank you.
And it says planned commercial zoning is required whenever a property owner applies for rezoning from non-commercial to zoning classification to a commercial zoning classification.
And that remains the same in the second
It
revision.
does, but it says, it qualifies that by saying, and the city attorney will help us with that because he's already looked at it, but it's intended to say that it is required on property located within a future, and it should say community center,
Yeah.
neighborhood center, or gateway corridor.
Okay, but
So
as our,
under
yeah.
the top language, John, you got to show us the top. Okay.
There's no reference to community centers, neighborhood centers, et cetera. We're
This
adding that in.
means this, and what was objected to as being overly broad was that
Yes.
if this were adopted, there would be no opportunity or ability for any property owner anywhere in the city limits to apply to change their zoning that would not be a planned district. And so what this does is it peels that back to say the planned commercial zoning is required on property located within a community center, neighborhood center, or gateway corridor identified in the comprehensive plan.
Okay, so I hope I'm reading the language right, but I don't think that's what it says.
Okay?
If I'm reading it right, you have, and one key there is in the second sentence, the word of should be or,
Right.
if I'm reading that correctly. So what it says is planned commercial zoning is required whenever a property owner applies for rezoning from non-commercial to commercial. That's one case. So it's required there. In the case of A1, it's required. Then the second option is or from one commercial zoning classification to a different zoning. That would not be the case here. And only in that case does the reference to community centers, neighborhood centers, or gateway corridors apply.
Yeah,
Oh, I see
and
what you're saying.
I guess it would take a English instructor or attorney to do it, because no matter how many times we read it, we don't interpret it that way,
Yeah.
because the operative starting
It needs-
point is when it's on property located within one of these. Otherwise, it's not
It
required.
needs
And
to
we're-
be turned around so that those exclusions become the subject of the sentence,
Okay.
don't you think?
Yeah, the way the
Yeah.
language is,
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
and frankly, I'm more comfortable with that because I think that, I mean, with the way I'm reading that
So
language.
what you're saying is whenever a property owner applies for rezoning or for one commercial zoning, planned commercial zoning is required if the property is located within a future community center, neighborhood center, or gateway. So you're saying start the sentence
that's
here
true.
whenever, and then make this tie in down there.
Yeah.
This language makes the neighborhood community centers and so forth apply only in the case of going from zoning from one commercial category to another.
Okay. So one option would be to repeat this language under both A and B. We told
Yes.
the city attorney we were trying to be
Yes.
faithful to his original.
It would. And I was sitting there sweating,
Okay.
well, not sweating, but thinking, is this what we're talking about? Because it doesn't seem like it's what we're talking
Yeah,
about.
yeah.
Glad you caught that.
You read more carefully than we.
Oh, yeah. That's what you're supposed to do.
I haven't
we're
heard
supposed
from
to do
Dustin
now.
what he thinks yet.
Yeah.
And then going back to what Mr. Freiberger mentioned about the development should have a comprehensive urban design scheme. Being vague, I think we could help clear that up by inserting compatible, and that development should have a compatible comprehensive urban design scheme. Does that make it?
A little
sense.
less broad.
How about comprehensive and compatible? Because there's a value to having comprehensive overview,
Yeah.
that language in
Yeah.
there.
That's
Yeah.
much better.
So,
Compatible is a super important word. Yes, because our objective is to be compatible and to have everyone satisfied in a situation. And these are situations that are going to be combustible, like the issue on Ohio. So the objective would be for the design to be sensitive to the location and be compatible to the neighborhood.
yes, right.
But we had trouble convincing the development community that that was our objective and not control of development. So compatible is a great word. I like compatible.
Yeah.
I'm all for that.
Well, the other two words that are important in the application of codes versus guidelines or other things is the difference between the word shall and the difference that and the word should. Because shall is mandatory and should is encouragement. And so the other important thing in that sentence is that development should have a comprehensive urban design scheme, and what we're suggesting is that that should not be fatal to a site plan if it's a single site and there's nothing there to be comprehensive. Because if you have a single site, it's difficult to have a comprehensive urban design scheme when that person has no control over what is around it. But the idea behind that is if you come in and you're developing the site where Kohl's is, it's saying that if you're a developer, you should try to unify your design scheme if you have a multi-lot commercial development so that the various components of that are compatible.
So, and it becomes a compatible, unifying urban design scheme.
Right. So
Actually,
when we looked at the plan for Buffalo Wild Wings and for the Shoe Carnival there, that was an add-on after Kohl's was already there. And one of the things that the Planning Commission looked at was whether that addition there was created a comprehensive design scheme for that development. Because if they had done something that was completely foreign or incompatible with the existing Kohl's, that would not have been a good, but you can't apply that when you have a single outlot or a single building. It's hard to have a comprehensive design scheme for a single lot.
But it's not comprehensive with office banks.
But it's not part of the same development. So
I don't want to get off the subject, but this all brings to mind the site where the mall is, for example. Because I think if there's a particular piece that could possibly be repurposed and reconfigured, and I don't want to get into how that should appear, but my question is simply, at this stage, how much license does a developer have to do that there? And how much control does the Planning Commission have in the future there? And can things like parking be reversed to the back side of the mall area if those buildings are removed and reconfigured as freestanding stores, that kind of thing? And I don't want to go into a big topic of discussion. I just simply want to know, as it stands, how much does a developer have in control and how much do we have, and how much do they have in front of them at this point as to what they could do?
But to help us with imagining that, Dillard's announcement that they plan to completely repurpose their store, and how will that be configured? Yes, is
Yeah, I'm just wondering how that procedure will take place.
I guess everyone on city staff took that announcement or pronouncement with a grain of salt, and so we're not putting a lot of stock in that other than, but the answer to your question is that the Central Mall is a planned development district. And any modification, deviation, amendment to that planned development district would have to be reviewed and approved by the Planning Commission and ultimately the governing body. Because, again, a planned development district operates under the same principles as a planned commercial district. It's just that the planned commercial district is supposed to be a little bit streamlined version of that same thing, mostly designed for since we're focusing on commercial, where is the thing you have to remember about the planned development district for Central Mall is it includes both residential and commercial components. So all of that land that is north of the Dillard's parking lot is zoned residential, but it is part of the Central Mall planned development district. So the Central Mall is actually a mixed-use development.
So if they had, if they had to expand that, then they would have to come and get that rezoned?
Well, if they wanted to expand that north,
Yes.
and they actually applied to do that once, and the Planning Commission postponed consideration because the plans were not well thought out. But at the time that Dick's Sporting Goods was looking to locate in Salina, the mall owners put forth a plan to try to expand the commercial area there north of the Dillard's parking lot. That plan actually came before the Planning Commission at a public hearing, but there were so many unanswered questions that the Planning Commission postponed consideration and gave them a list of homework items, which they never completed and eventually withdrew the application.
But they would have to do that.
They would have to do that.
So my question directly relating to this topic is, at present time, are there a list of design standards, if the mall was gone, let's say, it didn't exist there, are there a list of design standards that they would have to fulfill, or are we creating them as we speak? Or are they archaic, or do they need to be updated? Or if someone wanted to redevelop that, are the standards similar to what's there now, which would not be quite what we would envision probably in the future?
The thing about a planned development district is that there are no design standards. It is essentially a unique created zoning district where the Planning Commission and City Commission create the design standards.
So there are a set of design standards that exist.
There are not a set of, it depends on what your definition of design standards was.
So how is a
if they wanted to
developer
paint the exterior
know that?
color of the brick, there's no design standards that says the brick must remain white.
Right. But how would a developer then know what could be done on that site?
The ordinance that created the planned development district and the action that approved the site development plan, that site development plan is actually recorded in the Register of Deeds office, and if they make one change to the footprint or eliminate one building, they have to amend that development plan. So the original Central Mall did not have a Sears store. That Sears store was added in 1990, and their plan to reconfigure the Central Mall by adding a wing there for the Sears store and the auto center had to go before the Planning Commission and City Commission because the plan to add that store was not consistent with the original plan. Yeah. And so that is one of the things that the development community does not like about planned development districts and planned commercial districts. Yeah. Neighbors tend to like it because they know that plans can't change without a public hearing and Planning Commission and City Commission action. Developers don't like it because they can't change from the original without the same. So the one thing you have to remember is if you approve a site development plan for an Applebee's restaurant with a particular footprint, location, parking, landscaping, they can't change that without coming back before the Planning Commission to amend it. Now, neighbors tend to like that. Planning commissioners tend to like that. But commercial redevelopers don't all like that. Some consider that not intrusive. Some of them consider that to be intrusive.
So this is an appropriate place, I hope, for me to say what I said at the study session when there weren't a wide body of developers there to speak. And to this session, which is an open hearing, public hearing, and there's nobody here. I would like more input from them on an ongoing basis than my sense is that they don't feel they have to or that's not necessary.
And part of the, if you want to call it, the burden that development community feels that regulations impose on them, they also feel that it is a burden to have to attend multiple public hearings. We don't consider it a burden because it's part of our job and we want to get it right and we want to get input. What we do is we hold the hearings and we advertise them, and Crystal, I don't know who was on your distribution list, but it was a big list. And so everything that you got went to them, and it's their choice, and they have their methods of getting their input or their point across. But our job is to be transparent about what we're doing, and nothing we do with changing these ordinances and we're putting this up and we're being as transparent as we can about what we're proposing and discussing, and that's the way to do it.
So I'm trying to be as transparent as I can, and the other commissioners can speak to this, but when I read the language we've been talking about going from a non-commercial to commercial district, as I read it, and I think that's what it says as it reads, I like that better because then you're taking an entire area that has not been zoned commercial at all. And what we're saying is that if it's not in a neighborhood center, community center, et cetera, which, for example, the pumpkin patch, if I'm correct, is not, then they can do whatever the heck they want to with that without it coming to the Planning Commission under a planned commercial development district.
Well, I think that's
So far, so good?
I think that's a real overstatement, because
Okay.
if you ask the developers from Chicago, Illinois,
Yeah.
who redeveloped the UMB Bank site at Magnolia and 9th Street, whether they felt they were allowed to do whatever the heck they wanted, I can tell you, and Crystal was our lead communicator with them. By the time that we were done with them, they were fairly frustrated because their plans had to be revised about 4 times
And Dean, through the administrative process? I'm
through
hearing
the
you right?
administrative process.
Okay, I hear that.
So what I'm trying to convey is that, and we're receptive to do it either way, and we do think that anytime plans go to the Planning Commission, that developers tend to put their best plan and their best foot forward. But I don't want there to be any, we don't believe that because that plan was reviewed by Dustin 4 times, that somehow they got to do something that wasn't allowed. So if they're going to create drainage issues and they need stormwater detention, they've got to provide it. If they need parking, they've got to provide it. If they are supposed to have a certain amount of landscaping on the Magnolia Road frontage, they have to provide it.
Right. And I would accept your characterization that that's an overstatement.
So,
yeah, but
so
And a sidewalk
and
on Magnolia?
there's no room for a sidewalk on Magnolia.
Are we taking action on this tonight?
Well, but let me just finish my chain of thought here, if I could. So, yeah, I understand that, and I accept that's an overstatement. And again, in the spirit of making it clear for myself as well, and I'm also hearing you in the commercial district at 9th and Magnolia, the new stores are going in there, which is governed under present commercial zoning, which is another example of administrative review being a sufficient
The other thing that we need to make very clear that all planning commissioners understand is that if there is an objection to uses, that the time to object to uses is when the zoning is being discussed. And so we need to make it very clear that if somebody thinks that a particular location is an inappropriate location for a restaurant with drive-through service, the time to address that is not at the site plan review. The time to address that is to not zone the site whether you can have a drive-through restaurant. So my example would be that the Countryside Plaza that's on the east side of Ohio where Papa John's is allowed there, but a drive-through restaurant is not allowed there and would not be allowed there because that commercial zoning district does not allow restaurants with drive-up windows. But if you as a planning commission vote to approve zoning that allows restaurants with drive-up windows, you shouldn't then turn around and object to somebody who wants to locate a restaurant with a drive-up window there.
Yeah. Okay, and to the point then of these 7 suggestions for, not suggestions, standards for site development, the whole idea, if I'm getting that right, is that having these in place would mean that with the zoning process, these would be in place, and I'm hearing the developers, they already know about that ahead of time. It allows them to prepare a proposal that will fit.
Our goal is to be comprehensive. Our goal is to reflect. That's why we're having the public hearing. We're having it with you, and we want you to look at those 7 criteria. And if we miss something or we missed a topic, we've talked about buildings. We've talked about parking, loading, lighting, drainage. We've tried the trash disposal areas, looking at pedestrian accessibility both within the site and adjacent site, looking at safe ingress and egress. What we're trying to do is come up with a set of criteria that both reflects what you want to use to evaluate the quality of a site plan, and which also puts a developer who picks up our planned commercial district regulations and reads them and puts them on notice that says, if you submit a plan, it's going to be evaluated based on these criteria. And so the purpose of today's hearing was for you to look at that and say, well, this is good start, but it's under-inclusive. You need to address this, and this, and then that gets put forward, and then it gets incorporated in there. But this was intended to be our best effort to come up with criteria that says, when we have a site plan on the agenda for the Planning Commission, these are the things that are going to be looked at and are going to be used. And so if we go through there and we in our report address it's a permitted use, it meets setbacks, it has adequate buffers, it has enough landscaping, it doesn't exceed lot coverage, can be the judge about the location and arrangement of buildings, parking, those types of things. We give you a report on our engineers' evaluation of their driveway location and the traffic count on the street and where medians are located. And we talk about sidewalks and how people get from their cars to the building and building back to cars and how they can get to the adjoining neighborhoods. And we report to you on landscaping and how they're going to use the unpaved parts of their site. And we tell you where the trash disposal areas and outdoor storage areas are, and they're screened. And then at the meeting, you come up with additional criteria that we didn't address in our report, and the developer didn't have any way of knowing that was going to form the basis for your decision. That is not a good process.
But these would only be within the future community centers, neighborhood centers, or gateway corridor.
It would be where the planned commercial district is being submitted for your consideration, or there's one that already exists.
That's a good point. Yeah.
What role does aesthetics ever play in your deliberations when something's proposed? Materials and aesthetics probably go together.
Right, and so that is a question, and that's really where overlay districts come in. But that is, some communities do that, most do not. It can be proposed, and I would imagine there'll be some pushback from the development community on that.
Yeah,
but this is focused on the location and arrangement of buildings. There is stuff in the comprehensive plan that says the scale and style of development should be compatible. That's where the urban quality, design, and materials should be used for all development to encourage long-term commitment to a location. Mm-hmm. You could decide that the quality and materials that are proposed don't indicate a long-term commitment to a location. It looks like a disposable building. It looks like they don't have any commitment to Salina or being there. You can use that as one of your criteria. The other is to somehow, in the North Ohio overlay, we specify what the facade of the building facing the street has to be made of. We can do that, and we can go that far. Mm-hmm. But then that means if you don't meet it, your plan could be turned down.
Wasn't it City McPherson that all development is in a planned commercial district?
City McPherson does not have any planned commercial districts. What they have is, if you were in a straight commercial district and you apply for a building permit, that all site plans go to the Planning Commission. And the response I got to that from some in the development community was, yeah, but their Planning Commission only looks at zoning ordinance requirements. And so what we want to avoid is the situation where something gets made up at the meeting
Yeah.
as a requirement that nobody anticipated, including staff, was a requirement. Because we write pretty long reports, we write pretty comprehensive reports, but we can't, if it's not one of the criteria, we're not going to evaluate it for you because we didn't know that that was one of the criteria. So we're not saying that these 7 are perfect, but we think it's pretty good. The other thing that we're looking to doing is taking these same things and even incorporating them into a site plan that would involve administrative approval, so that essentially we would have the same criteria apply whether you're getting administrative approval or a planning commission approval.
I completely agree, but then I think we do need to consider tweaking some of those components from the back end, so we don't have those issues pop up, because I think we still have specific concerns that could be seen as thrown out there on the table at inappropriate moments, but they're really things that are lagging behind on particular. I'll bring it up on other matters. There's one little thing that I think will clarify.
Okay, so to answer to your question, because what we want to do is get input from you on it, and I've heard the about the rearranging the language in that one thing, and we're going to add the word location to arrangement or placement there, and we will tweak those things. But the purpose of today was to get general direction from you, allow based on the suggestions and modifications that you would have us make. Then we can get with the city attorney, make sure that those are worded in a legally defensible manner, and then come back with a public hearing draft vetted by the city attorney that we feel is ready for a vote. And so your choices would be to continue this to your next meeting, which might lengthen that meeting, or to continue it to your first meeting in November, which would then be, we would hopefully have a public hearing draft for you to actually vote up or down on.
I have a couple comments.
Commissioner?
Sorry, I'm slow. I appreciate your language, and I think you've covered, in thinking back some of the things we've talked about, and I could say in particular for me, the Ohio and Crawford Street, it seems like you've addressed things that were concerns to the neighborhood, and one thing I've thought about, like if we were to take this to neighborhood centers, and it'd be, I don't know if if there's a way to word it, or if it's too restrictive, but in looking at where these neighborhood centers are, and in knowing that like North Salina doesn't have services like a bank or a grocery store or a drugstore. It seems like in these neighborhood centers, if only there's a way to mix things up. Like right now at Ohio Street and Crawford, there are several fast food restaurants, and it'd be nice if there was another neighborhood use. But I don't know. It's probably getting too restrictive, or how would you come up with all the needs that might be met? But let's say there, do we need a bank there? Or do we need a doctor's office there? Or, you know what I'm trying to say?
Well, the thing is that zoning is permissive, but it's not directive. So you can try to encourage a use to go there by being permissive, but it's still essentially going to be a market decision as to whether they choose to do that. So the location that we've been discussing on South Ohio, you could put a doctor's office there, you could put a bank there, you could put an insurance office there. That's going to be what a landowner or investor wants to invest in that particular location. But the zoning can't really mandate what goes there. It can restrict certain uses out and permit certain uses in, but it can't really direct. The only way you can do that is, and I don't think of many communities that have, you literally have to put a cap on the number of uses, or you'd have to have a separation requirement. So
Yeah.
there are some communities that have, when it comes to payday loan companies or things like that, they have a density requirement and says if you have a payday loan company, it cannot be located within 1,000 feet of another payday loan company, so you don't have a area where they concentrate. But you could do that. I think if you said you couldn't locate a fast food restaurant within 1,000 feet of another fast food restaurant, I don't think that would be well received by the market. But
If you said, though, that business can only cater to, say, 100 customers a day, which would limit the amount of traffic going in, could you do that?
But you wouldn't want to say that in all neighborhood centers.
No, I'm saying for particular
High
locations.
traffic areas.
the best way to do that is to limit it by use. And so the property that is where Dillon's is located and their fueling facility and all that is Zone C3 Shopping Center District. The property across the street where Papa John's is Zone C2 Neighborhood Commercial. And neighborhood commercial does not allow restaurants with drive-through service. So the way to address that is through the uses that are allowed in the zoning. And so by the C2 district specifically allows only sit-down restaurants and cafes, or in the case of Papa John's, they don't have sit-down, but they deliver. But it doesn't allow drive-in restaurants or convenience stores because those are high traffic generator uses. But if you took the corner of Ohio and Crawford and you downzoned it to C2, what you probably end up having is a whole bunch of empty buildings, because for better or for worse, those in the development community look at traffic counts, and that's what attracts them is traffic counts. And so it's just a fact of retail and commercial analysis. They don't want to locate their new facility in a place where there's no traffic. They want to locate in a place where there is traffic already.
That makes sense. And I guess it would come down to items 4 and 5, maybe, whether that is safe. The vehicular ingress and egress.
And that's where you have to put the pressure on staff, whether it's engineering or planning staff or whatever, and say, convince us that this is the best, safest location for vehicular access, or this should be right in and right out, or there should be no left turns, or they should be limited to one driveway and not have two. Those are all kinds of things that are discretionary.
Why wouldn't the business know that? I mean, to me, if that's going to hinder traffic counts, making it hard to egress and ingress, why doesn't the business understand that?
Because a lot of businesses that come to Salina are multi-location, multi-community businesses, and they don't do things blind, but if their selection criteria is based on traffic counts, then they're going to rule out a lot of locations, and they're going to focus on locations where the traffic counts are, and they'll make their selection based on that, and then they'll bear down and look at the details later.
And
But
then-
if you're not familiar with Salina, Kansas, and you get some data from Salina, Kansas, and you find traffic counts at this intersection, this intersection, this intersection, and you are making that decision from a distance, then you're going to say, all right, I've narrowed down my criteria to this, and so that's how those types of locations get selected.
So Commissioner Good, you had another.
Just, would you clarify, you said if we didn't approve of a drive-up window, we should have denied that at early on, and at what point?
Well, here's our job, and your job's to ask, and our job is to tell you, and we try to provide a list, but you can always ask and clarify. But if all that property at Crawford, Ohio is zone C5, service commercial, and restaurants with drive-up windows are permitted use in that district, and you recommended C5 zoning, and our assumption is when the Planning Commission recommends C5 zoning, which everything else is there, that you understand when you're making that recommendation that the list of uses in C5 includes restaurants with drive-up service. And so and that's the point I want to make, the distinction between zoning and planned commercial zoning is if you look at a request to rezone the pumpkin patch to commercial zoning, we're going to tell you what uses are allowed in that request, and you're supposed to evaluate those uses and compare that to what is around it and say, are those compatible and do they fit? So you are supposed to be looking at those things when you make a recommendation to whether to zone or rezone. The site plan is looking at the detail of the arrangement of the site, but when you're looking at uses, you should look at that when the zoning application is heard. And so when you, as a body, recommended the rezoning of the property where Menards is, our assumption as a staff is that you understand that there's a wide range of commercial uses that could go in there, including restaurants and restaurants with drive-up service and all that, and that entered into one of your criteria is whether the uses allowed in that district are compatible with what's around it. And so we just wanted to reemphasize that if the concern is about particular uses, the time, and the good thing about planned commercial districts is you could have a planned commercial district and delete uses. So if you want to approve a planned commercial district for a particular location and your recommendation is that restaurants with drive-up service be deleted from that planned commercial district, the time to do that is when the zoning is being requested, not at the site plan stage.
So again, so we have a specific in mind, the pumpkin patch area under this language would not be in a neighborhood overlay or community center, and so we'd be looking at regular, not planned commercial zoning for that. We're anticipating, but that would be, and I understand that.
And that
right?
remains to be seen. It's what gets adopted. But if our substitute language got adopted and we cleaned it up so everybody agreed that it's only in community centers, neighborhood centers, and gateways where it's required, then it would not be required that they apply for it up front. However, this language here says that the Planning Commission or Board of Commissioners may direct a property owner to amend their application if it finds that a planned commercial district is needed to ensure more compatible land use relationships. So there was an application filed to expand the Green Lantern convenience store at Ohio and Iron, and that was a request for straight commercial zoning. It got all the way to the City Commission, and the City Commission found that planned commercial zoning was needed to ensure that there was more compatibility between what was being proposed there and the surrounding neighborhood. So they declined to approve straight C5 zoning, and they directed the applicant to amend their application to planned commercial. And so anytime, so the way this is set up is that when we're meeting with an applicant, we're going to sit down and say, you're in a community center, you're in a neighborhood center, you're in a gateway, your application has to be for planned commercial. If you're outside that area, they can submit an application for straight commercial zoning, but you are not obliged to recommend approval of that if it gives you discomfort.
I appreciate your saying that, Dean. Yes, Commissioner?
I think that we have been largely relying on the comprehensive plan as the beginning of that discussion. Is that letting us down?
Why do you think the comprehensive plan would be letting you down?
Well, if we have been making inadvertent decisions about that sort of detail you're describing now, it seems to me we should have been warned off by the comprehensive plan. Does that not think down to the detail of whether a drive-up window is involved or?
Well, one of the things that was done, and it's remembered by staff, it tends not to be, that the applicant in that case also applied to amend the comprehensive plan to expand the list of potential zoning districts that fit within a neighborhood center. And that was approved, and the city commission even approved that. And the district that they added to the neighborhood center is a district that allows restaurants with drive-up windows. So that change was made to the comprehensive plan to recognize districts in neighborhood centers that did allow restaurants with drive-up service. So again, our job, your job is to question us, our job is to inform you, but if you are faced with a request to take non-commercial property, rezone it to commercial, and for whatever reason you don't think that a district that allows restaurants with drive-up service to be approved, then our job is to tell you what the alternatives are. And one alternative is to say, well, we'll zone it C2 where those aren't allowed.
Right.
But the only thing that we would need in terms of action today would be to give the city attorney time to clean this up for you and to reopen the public hearing. And we've got a number of items for the 17th, but I can't, based on the number of things that have been assigned to the attorney, it might be more realistic to continue this hearing to your November 7th meeting. And at that time, we would come with what we call a public hearing draft. You're still not obliged to take action on it, but we would try to get it cleaned up so it's something that you could vote up or down on.
I have a motion, if you're ready.
No.
No?
I would like to add something else to item number 6. In it, I'm all for native plants, and there are a lot of plants on the approved city's recommended xeriscape plant list that is not native plants. And I would like to add some language in there that we encourage the planting of plants native to Kansas.
And the challenge with that, and we're going to put that responsibility at your feet to provide that to staff and your fellow commissioners, because our list was developed in cooperation with the Dick Arboretum in Heston and the Kansas State Forestry Service, and they don't recognize a distinction between drought tolerant and plants that are suitable for Salina's climate and soils and native plants. So what, if the city of Salina is going to have a native plant list, then there has to be a list. We can't just do it by subtraction. We can't have a landscape plan and have it rejected because it doesn't have any native trees on it, because no one except you seems to know what those are.
Commissioner Buffett, I have a question. Do you suggest that as mandatory or as suggested?
Well, I would like it mandatory, but I don't know that that would fly. I would suggest.
That is the item that I said we should tweak, and the point that I had for other matters.
Okay.
But I don't think it really should be discussed at this point because it's not part of this.
Okay.
Well,
I'll
it
rely on
it
that.
can be part of that. That can be expanded. I'm simply saying that we rely on our city forester, we rely on the state forester, we rely on the Dick Arboretum and professionals in that field to develop our list. And so we would have to take that list and put asterisks by plants that are native, or we'd have to do something, and we don't have any sources, resources, authorities, anybody who has done that and who is willing to make that distinction between those which are native and those which are suitable. And
I would suggest that we ought to go a little slower on that one. There are a lot of plants that are really valuable to Salina for a lot of purposes, appropriate in places that are not native. And we would have a hard time, I think, finding enough plants that are truly native to this place that would serve all of our needs. It's just not very feasible. I think we can get some backing on that. Maybe we can talk more together and see if I can convince you, but I'm a little worried about that
Commissioner
one.
Freiberg, was that what you wanted to talk about in other matters?
Yes. But I don't believe a list exists, and I don't think that that's a part of application Z17-5 at this point.
Okay.
In the future, possibly.
Well, I think since the list was developed, more information has been garnered, and Dick Arboretum, I think, could come up with a list right now that says, and that are very, very appropriate plants for Salina. And I think it's something we should aspire to. And it doesn't maybe have to be part of this plan, but it's something that we should further investigate.
Commissioner Buffett, would you want to see if Dick Arboretum could supply that to you and distribute that to the commission and
Well,
staff?
I don't know that we want to completely rely on that, but I think that between
No, I'm just saying
other
for purposes of
resources, yes,
discussion.
yes,
Yeah,
yes.
just for your benefit, what we did at that time was that we had multiple representatives of the Dick Arboretum come to Salina and had a 2-hour study session with the city commission. And what we found at the time was we were in a water shortage, water conservation period, and we had a number of plantings that were water intensive. And so what we did was, with their guidance, we went in and eliminated plants that required a great deal of irrigation and tried to focus on those that, and that's why we refer to that as our recommended xeriscape plant list, because we are trying to promote drought tolerant plants and xeriscape type plantings, and so that's why we have emphasized that here. But there are, as Mrs. Jackson pointed out, there's a number of species on our xeriscape plant list that are not native to Kansas, but are nonetheless, they're suitable for our climate, our water conditions. But we would need some outside technical assistance to come up with a classification of something that, whether it's suitable or whether it's actually a native plant.
Okay, with that in mind and knowing that we're getting ready to go, is there any other comment on the 3 items that the staff is looking for direction on before we look for a motion?
Do you like the idea of having the standards that are shall and the principles or guidelines that are should, and incorporate both of those in there?
Yes.
Okay.
We should, however, define the difference between those two words. A lot of people won't notice. That's too similar, and it's a fine point. So the language should be a little more expansive so it makes it clear.
Yeah. And one of the things that we were, and John, if you could scroll up, one of the things we were looking to do is changing this to say the site plan shall be approved or disapproved on the basis of the following criteria, and then on the other part say that the site plan will also be evaluated based on the following criteria, and that would get into the comprehensive plan principles.
And not to be too bad an English teacher, but one of them says elevated, we want evaluated. Crystal's already got that.
But we changed
Okay,
it.
good.
We
Yeah.
changed it after
That's
the
good.
packet
Okay.
went
I
out.
appreciate that. Okay, I think a motion is ready. Commissioners, Mr. Freiberg, are you ready to make the motion?
I would move that application Z17-5 be postponed or continued, I should say, until the November 7th meeting for further revision.
November
Second.
7th or
November 7th?
October 17th?
November 7th.
Okay.
The later date of the two that were recommended. Is there a second? Okay, it's been moved and seconded. Any further discussion? If not, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, same sign. And motion carries. Thank you very much. All right, Commissioner Freiberger, well, we didn't have administrative items. Are there administrative items?
Our only housekeeping items are that neither Mr. Herz or I have registered yet for the state planning conference because we haven't come across the actual registration materials, but when we find them, we will forward them out
Great.
to all the planning commissioners. There will be a special track that's geared towards planning commissioners, and then our plan is that for Thursday night we're having a reception for all the conference participants at the Marymount Administration Building, and so some opportunity for touring the building and the facilities there, but it will be a social Thursday night between the Thursday and Friday.
And do you know what time
Sessions.
that'll be,
What are
Dean?
the dates?
Dustin might be able to tell you what time the reception starts.
I believe the time frame of the reception is 6 to 9:30, if I remember correctly.
What's the date?
That'll be the evening of the 19th, October 19th.
Yeah, 19 and
So
20.
the two dates of the conference are Thursday, October 19th, and Friday, October 20th.
So the idea is that hopefully we'll have a number of people from out of Salina staying overnight here for the 2-day conference, and that we give them a social activity on Thursday evening for socializing.
And I'm sorry I didn't have my pin out, Dustin. What time? 6:30, you said?
I believe it's 6 to 9:30.
6
That's
to
off
9
the top of my head. That's not in
6 to 9:30.
stone, but that's what
Okay.
I'm remembering.
Yeah, okay.
And Dustin's in charge of the menu, so
Hey.
we'll see how that
All right.
goes.
We're looking
Gonna be healthy,
some
right.
fine performance from you on that.
So that's the update there. The other thing I wanted to alert the commissioners, if we haven't already, is that the commission is now at 7 members. Mr. Boxa has resigned from the commission, and so we are now at 7 members, and so we're in need of a 1 inside the city resident, and then Mrs. Jackson is our outside the city rep number 1, and we need a second person who lives outside but within 3 miles of the city limits to get our
Yeah.
full complement of 9. So
Yeah.
we are in need of 1 city resident and 1 out of city resident to get. We are at 7 now, and we need to get back up to 9. So those are our only other matters. Announcements. Some of you attended the City Commission study session or parts of there on the special assessment question, which will continue to be a policy issue as we move forward.
Okay, preliminary discussion items? Are there any?
Is that
No.
my, oh, sorry.
Is this the
So-
appropriate place?
Yeah, I guess not.
Then we can, whatever other matters that you have for us, we just put in the information there about American Planning Association's Great Places program, and so far they've identified 2 great places in Kansas, so maybe
Okay.
we have one.
All right. So other matters from any commissioner?
Yes, I have one. Quickly, I'll make it very quick, Mr.
He
Story.
hasn't done a formal announcement.
A
about it,
lot
so I don't-
of I've had a lot of response for the past year from people in the community, and the issue has been revision of the plant lists. So,
The what?
and
Really?
they have offered involvement and they've offered participation. So this is a number of professional growers. Also, there are some architects and there are some people from the development community that have been concerned about the plant list requirements. So across the board, there have been a whole lot of people suggest that they would like to be involved in that process. And I think it's something that we really need to look at and address by possibly a study session and inviting some of these people or all of these people that want to participate, because they all have voices that have reason, and I know them all, and they're all in some way involved in this process already in Salina. So although I'm sure they all have particular interest and bias, that's why we're here, and so I think we should bring them together. We should explain what we have currently, consider what could be possible, and work towards some kind of revision that would satisfy people. But that would, I guess, take scheduling some kind of study session to begin with. So that's my other matter.
Yeah, I think the most recent study session that we had was exactly on the whole concept of xeriscaping. But I don't know if Dustin has, but I have to admit that I have not. We get feedback occasionally about the landscape regulations in total, but I haven't received much feedback on the actual plant list.
Yeah, this
But-
wasn't really feedback on the plant list. It was the desire to be involved in the revision or construction of a new plant list.
Isn't there a city forester?
Yes.
I believe so.
That-
And
Mhm.
He would obviously be included, I presume.
I was told by a city employee that was involved with developing the plant list and that native plants don't work in Salina.
Oh, that's not true, of course.
This is
Yeah.
what I was told.
Yeah, I get it.
And again, a lot of these people are growers, landscapers, professionals in the plant industry. And the feelings that I understood from them were that, things have evolved and changed since then. And they're looking at new implementation of plantings.
Like what? New plants? Is that what you're saying?
I
or-
think, no, just the choices, the plant choice has changed due to climate and drought and things like that. It's not my area of expertise. It's just that I think as chairman, they felt like I was the one to direct the inquiries to. Plus, I'm probably the most prolific in social media on that subject.
Yeah. So, Commissioner Freiberger, would it be asking too much, or would you feel comfortable with putting together a list of people who might appear at such a
Of course,
session?
because I
Give that
certainly
list
have
to
that.
the commission and to the staff?
Definitely.
That would help
I
us
have
plan.
all of their contacts. And
Okay.
they continually ask to meet and for outreach, and I think that's more of something that this body should do rather than me personally.
Okay, that would certainly give us more
I'm
information
not
to go
going
on,
to
I would
change
think.
the plant list myself.
Are we usurping the duties of the tree board?
I think they should all be incorporated. Parks and Rec, the whole gamut of people that are involved in that process.
Well, I definitely think the city should only plant native plants, but,
Right. We're
part-
aware
part-
you think that, and
part of
I
the-
agree.
Part of the problem, though, is that, especially with Roundup Ready corn, a lot of habitat for native species is being poisoned off by the Roundup, and there are very few places for, especially monarch butterflies, to find food and lay eggs. And so we could do that, in the city.
But
And-
I think that's an education process,
Yes.
and we haven't undertaken that. And I believe we have to undertake that as stewards and those concerned for sustainability in this community.
But also, nesting birds, bird food. mammal food, whatever the case may be.
Exactly. Exactly.
That might be a good occasion for discussion
It'd
of
be
all
very
that and
interesting.
incorporate the boards. Were there any other matters? I thought I saw maybe some other. No?
No.
No? Okay. Mr. Lakewitz? No? Okay. Are there no other matters?
The streetscape study or open house
Yes.
is going on.
Yeah, there
till
is
7.
an ongoing till 7 o'clock at the Salina Arts Center, an open house on the downtown streetscape project.
All righty. We got 45 minutes to do that. I guess I can declare us adjourned. So we are adjourned. All right.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, all right.